What part of Vampire the Masquerade do you actually turn into a video game? With the whole mess of games across more than 2 decades, the answer seems to be basically anything. Over the years, Vampire the Masquerade has been adapted into a first-person RPG, an almost isometric CRPG, visual novels, interactive fiction, a VR stealth game, and a battle royale. And honestly, I think they all have something interesting going on. And that's all because of the simple fact that these games are trying to adapt something that was never really designed to be a video game in the first place. Vampire the Masquerade is an essential gothic punk tabletop role-playing game released in 1991. It was created by Mark Reinhagen and published by White Wolf Publishing. It was the first of many games built around the storyteller system and the shared World of Darkness setting. It was a pretty big success. The second edition came out only a year later, and Vampire quickly established itself as one of the major tabletop RPGs of the 1990s. Part of what made it stand out was its emphasis on character drama, narrative, and role-playing, rather than the increasingly dense combat and rules-focused people associated with games like Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Now, it's worth mentioning that the RPG industry was already moving in this direction. Vampire didn't single-handedly invent narrative-focused role-playing, but it was very good at packaging that idea into something that felt completely different from the fantasy RPGs dominating the hobby. It took inspiration from things like Call of Cthulhu, Nightlife, the work of Joseph Campbell, and vampire films like The Lost Boys, which is objectively like a top 10 film of all time, by the way. And although context is important, the most important part isn't really where Vampire got its influences from, but it's what it does with being a vampire. Vampire the Masquerade uses vampirism to explore things like morality, identity, power, and the human condition, because to them, being a vampire isn't just a power fantasy, it's also a pain in the ass. You're stronger than regular humans, you can manipulate people, and you can survive things that would kill any ordinary person. But you also need to drink blood to survive. You're at risk of losing control of yourself, and you have to hide who you are. Ideally, you don't become a complete monster, that there's no person left underneath it. That's the fundamental tension of Vampire the Masquerade. The world this all takes place in is called the World of Darkness. Essentially our own, but all the horrible things you thought were imaginary are actually real, and vampires have their own secret society operating underneath it. Clans, sects, elders, princes, anarchs, feeding territories, ancient grudges that have probably been going on longer than the countries they're feuding in. All of it's over the Masquerade. Humanity shouldn't know they exist, and keeping it that way is the main problem they face. Which creates a very important contradiction, where you give your player a bunch of supernatural powers, and then tell them to not use them in front of people. And I think this is where the difficulty of making a Vampire the Masquerade video game starts to become obvious. A normal vampire game can basically ask, wouldn't it be cool to be a vampire? But adapting from the tabletop game, it's a slightly more complicated question. Wouldn't it be cool right up until it starts becoming a problem? You have power, there's a cost. You have freedom, but not freedom from consequence. You can't kill people carelessly. You can use your supernatural abilities, but doing it openly threatens the Masquerade. And underneath all of that is the question that the tabletop game was really interested in asking. How much of yourself are you willing to sacrifice to survive? So let's cut the melodrama for a second. So when you make a video game out of this, which part do you actually want to preserve, right? You could keep the powers, the setting, the role-playing, the politics, the personal horror. You could just make a game where you can turn into a bat and fuck people up, right? So, to my knowledge, there's been like 15 releases of a licensed Vampire the Masquerade game. So we're going to go through some of those, and I'm just going to highlight the things I think it's adapted well and the things I maybe think it's adapted not so well. And we'll see from there, right? This one was the first. It was developed by Nihilistic Software and published by Activision in 2000. It is probably one of the most literal examples of somebody asking, how do we turn this into an RPG? The game follows Christoph Romuald, a 12th century crusader who's turned into a vampire before eventually finding himself thrown into the modern world of darkness, chasing after the woman he was into while he was still mortal. And honestly, the story has a lot going for it, because the basic premise is almost tailor-made for the system of vampire. A man who has spent his life fighting monsters suddenly becomes one. A devout Christian crusader is forced to exist as one of the undead creatures he was taught to hate. His entire previous identity gets turned upside down, and that's exactly the kind of personal horror that you should be interested in playing Vampire the Masquerade.
Good my lord, why dost thou look so strangely upon me?
My mind is filled with thoughts of such base villainy. My hunger for thee is stronger now than when my heart did pump its own warm blood.
Unfortunately, the problem is what you actually spend most of your time doing. You're just fighting stuff all the time. Lots and lots of fighting stuff. Redemption is fundamentally a party-based RPG built around real-time combat, resource management, and dungeon crawling. You're managing your blood during combat, juggling party's actions, upgrading characters, and just grinding away through encounters, which means the tabletop's emphasis on social drama and player-driven problem-solving is pushed way into the background. It's not necessarily a bad game for doing this, it's just answering a slightly different question. What if Vampire the Masquerade was actually an action RPG? So, I think my final rating for this game, not just as a game, but also as an adaptation of Vampire the Masquerade, is a 3 out of 5. As for the areas I'm ranking, I would say Redemption has an RPG freedom of 2, a vampire fantasy of 4, a personal horror of 3, but a social drama and investigation of 1. This time developed by Troika and published by Activision, they took another stab at it 4 years later. And this time, their approach was radically different. Instead of following a fixed protagonist through a big linear vampire story, Bloodlines puts you in the role of a newly embraced vampire trying to survive the political nightmare of LA in 2004. You choose your clan, you build your character, you decide how to approach quests. You can talk your way through situations, sneak around them, manipulate people, use your supernatural abilities, or, yes, just shoot everyone. And this is where Bloodlines feels a lot closer to the tabletop game, because the important question isn't just how powerful is my character, is who is my character? And Nosferatu is going to have a completely different relationship with the world than a Toreador would, and playing a Malkavian changes how you experience conversations altogether. Your skills can determine whether you persuade somebody, intimidate them, sneak past them, or just turn them into paste. That's the sort of player expression that the tabletop is really good at. Bloodlines is probably the closest we've ever gotten to putting that philosophy into a vampire game, which makes things even more interesting when you consider what it gets wrong. Eventually, the game starts to run out of ways to let you be a character and make your own decisions, because it just starts making you fight stuff over and over again. That's partly because of the constrained development time Activision gave Troika Games, but it exposes a huge problem I have with the game. The game is incredibly good at letting you act like a vampire, but considerably less so interested in asking what being a vampire actually does to you. Humanity exists, but for much of the game it can feel less like a deep exploration of morality and more like a meter telling you, don't be a murder hobo. There are exceptions. The encounter in Hollywood involving the serial killer is a particularly good example of the game making your vampirism feel genuinely uncomfortable, but there's also moments where the fledgling feels like less of a person and more a vessel for the player character to fuck around in LA, which isn't necessarily bad. In fact, it's one of the reasons Bloodlines is so much fun, but it does reveal something important. A game can successfully adapt the structure of Vampire without necessarily adapting its themes. So my final rating for Bloodlines is a 4, with an RPG freedom of 5, a vampire fantasy of 5, a personal horror of 2, social drama of 4, and an investigation of 4. And that was it for Vampire the Masquerade until about 2017, because after Bloodlines, we got nothing for a while. There were the World of Darkness projects, there was a whole reboot with Vampire the Requiem, there was a couple Hunter the Reckoning video games that came out. I think UA Ball got the movie rights to one of them, but it wasn't until 2017 when we got a new game for Vampire the Masquerade, which was World of Darkness Preludes, Vampire and Mage. It was an interactive fiction game released initially on mobile devices. And suddenly, the answer to how do we make a vampire game became, don't. Well, not in the traditional sense at least. Preludes was interactive fiction, which was just a visual novel without the illustrations. It's basically a branching story where your choices determine how events unfold. And honestly, it makes a ridiculous amount of sense. Because if the tabletop strength of Vampire is conversation, characterization, difficult choices, and drama, interactive fiction has a pretty direct route to those things. You didn't need elaborate combat systems, you don't need a physics engine, you don't need to figure out how to turn every discipline into a satisfying action game ability. You can just let the player make decisions. And that's what a lot of post-2017 Vampire games started experimenting with. And this worked really, really well, I think, but it exposes just another problem with adaptation, because tabletop Vampire isn't just about making choices. It's about making those choices as your character. There's a difference between, I think this is the morally interesting choice, and my character would absolutely fucking do this, even if it's a terrible idea. In a tabletop game, the person making the decision and the character making the decision can pull in completely different directions, and that friction is one of the things that makes the role-playing work. An authored video game has a much harder time reproducing it, because eventually, someone has written all the choices you're allowed to make for you already. But that's where you get the choice to decide what's more important to you for a Vampire the Masquerade game. Do you want a very intentional, well-written story, or do you want the power fantasy and agency of controlling a character yourself? I don't think it's fair to not include this one after I've been yammering on about power fantasy for 13 minutes, but I'm going to try and make this one quick because it's kind of a joke including this. Blood Hunt is, or was, rest in peace, a battle royale game set in Prague where each clan would represent a different playstyle. It had very interesting gunplay, incredible movement and ability usage, and it was insanely fun. But I wouldn't venture to really call this a Vampire the Masquerade game. It was kind of Apex Legends mixed with Crackdown, mixed with Prototype. And after all this experimentation, someone had to do the obvious thing, right? Which was to make a sequel to the game that had now gained cult status, Bloodlines. Unfortunately, it was passed around the development purgatory, and what we got had people coming to the general consensus that it should not have had the Bloodlines name. I have a lot of contempt for this game, so it's going to be hard to be objective when I say this. The game insults your intelligence and ruins your ability to absorb things in the world like atmosphere, dialogue, any sort of interaction by putting a Malkavian in your head that comments on absolutely everything. Dwelling on any kind of immersion at all is difficult, and the game loses what makes Bloodlines good in the first place. There's only ever one solution to any problem you're given. It's fight, fight, fight. There's very hardly any consequence for the different clans you can pick, dialogue rarely matters, and choices are just fake altogether, having no real bearing on the game at all. Although to give the game its dues, there is something I do think it does incredibly well, and that is the very satisfying combat. I think it sells that half of the vampire fantasy very well, but only that half of the vampire fantasy. The power, nothing else really. The story isn't particularly interesting. A lot of the characters feel very flat and one-dimensional. I'm not going to provide a rating for this one. I think it only does the combat well, and I'll let you make your decision on what you think it does well to adapt the tabletop game Vampire the Masquerade. So, we've reached the end of what I would consider my list of noteworthy Vampire the Masquerade games that have been released. I believe the best is yet to come though, with Eternal Whispers on the horizon. Maybe we'll see like a return to multiple ways to solve issues, like real role-playing and incredible writing, which I've come to expect from games like Disco Elysium. Well, I suppose I never did answer that question at the start, did I? What part of Vampire the Masquerade would I turn into a video game? I'd probably just make a fighting game.